As requested, we're going to be looking at Ciri today. Ciri is not my favorite card, but she's very, very close, and I think she's the most interesting card for deck building, even more so than Shoop and Rada. And let's take a look at her for a second. So she's a Witcher, neutral, 8 power, 9 provisions, and deploy if your starting deck does not have cards with provision cost 10 or more, gain resilience, shield, and veil. Now, of these, the resilience is the most impactful, as resilience is extremely powerful, and the shield and veil kind of help you maintain that she'll stay out. Veil mostly useful just against the decks that run poison for their removal, but against those she's incredibly valuable. She's also really good against bounty with Witchfinder because she tanks all those bounties. It's a random interaction there. And then you have the shield, which prevents damage. So normally if your opponent plays a really big card, say you play a monsters player and they play their She Who Knows, and it's at 10, you can and you can't remove it with like a heat wave. You can mitigate the carryover if it's the highest power card by hitting it with like a Alzur's Thunder type 5 damage card. But resilience is really where it's at. And if we take a look at the resilience cards in the game, we have plenty of locations as they've been adding resilience to locations. But let's take a look at the units for a second. In a similar range to Ciri, you have Gabor and Zoltan. Both have differences. They're both essentially dwarf deck cards though, so if you're running dwarves, you can run a resilience package with them. You have the Sausage Maker, which I legitimately have seen played one time, I think, since it came out. And then we have Vandergrift, which I think is very comparable. It has shield and resilience, two of the things Ciri has, and he's just lacking the veil. But at only 1 provision less, he's a 6 instead of an 8, but Vandergrift is a really interesting card. He's very similar in a lot of ways to Ciri. He's got the resilience. He's just 2 less power for 1 less provision, and he doesn't have the veil. The veil not being very impactful most of the time. And then we have She Who Knows is very expensive, but she does offer that big resilience. If you've ever played against a She Who Knows deck, and she comes down in last play with that Sabbath, you know just how strong that carryover is. And Ciri offers a pretty comparable level of carryover, but she cannot go for 3 rounds like the She Who Knows can. And then we have the Musicians of Blaviken, which is 2 random, and then we have the Meditating Mages, which everybody hates with good reason. So, as far as resilience units go, she's still one of the best with her ability. The question remains then, is her ability really worth it? And I think to illustrate this point, what we're going to do is we'll just take a look at a faction, and we're going to play, let's go Scoia'tael, because I play Scoia'tael the most. The issue that you run into Ciri is that most decks lately, especially when they release these sets of 6 or 7 legendary cards that they have been a couple times, is you get this problem where decks sort of rely on having these high provision cards that define them. So, for example, we have Saskia Commander. You can't really play a lot of the decks that rely on Commander without her, so you can't use Ciri in those decks. You can't use any scenarios, obviously, so those are all gone. And if you look at something like the Nature's Gifts decks, you really want your Ethne in there because you have to have those Symbiosis if you're playing a Symbiosis deck. And we'll just kind of mention that some cards that are high provisions, you just have to run in most decks for certain factions. Simloss being those. If you're playing Scoia'tael, you're going to run Simloss. If you're running Skellige, you're going to run Fukusha. There's like no way around it. You kind of have to have those cards in your deck. But even more problematic is stuff like this. You cannot really play Dwarves without Broover. So some decks rely on these high version cards. And when you have Ciri, you can't use these. So you kind of have to find decks or archetypes that don't rely on these high version cards. And those are really hard to find as the game more polarizes the cards into these archetype decks. Which I like, by the way. It just doesn't help Ciri out. So what can you do with her then? Well, before we get into that, I just want to mention 2 things here in the neutral cards. One thing you're going to lack a lot of times in Ciri decks is removal. Heatwave being at 10 is the most played removal in the game, and very closely is Vigo's Muzzle with its C's. They're both 10 version cards, you can't run them. And if you're going to run a bomb package, which a lot of decks that want control but don't have control in their faction do, is you run Madoc with bombs, and he's a 10 also, so you can't use him. And then if you want to run any of the Geralt cards, they're also all 10 or higher, so you can't quite do that either. The other thing you sort of lack is consistency, but this has been alleviated when they moved Royal Decree to 9 provisions. What a great change for Ciri decks, and warranted for sure. By the way, Call of the Forest is still 10 provisions and only boosts by 1, just so developers know that. But Royal Decree, a fantastic card that helps out with the Ciri decks. So that's your consistency card here. And the last thing I want to mention here in neutrals is that when we talk about decks or strategies that rely on having cards that are 9 provisions or less, there is one that always comes to mind, and one that I've made, I don't know, 5, 6 videos on this channel about over the past year or two, and that is Hyperthin. And the reason why we talk about Hyperthin with Ciri Nova is because it's one of those decks that its entire strategy relies on cards that are less than 9 provisions. What do I mean? Well, Triss is an 8. It used to be a 9. It got buffed to an 8. Yennefer is an 8. These are the 2 cards that are your finishers. And if you're playing Nilfgaard, you have Zarthesius for another one, and he is also a 9 provisions. So pretty much all of the finishers and power cards for Hyperthin fall in this 9 provision or lower range. And the other cards you want to come out of your deck are Roach and Knickers. Sometimes you can have difficulty finding provisions for them. But with Ciri Nova, everything in your deck costs 9 provisions or less. You find yourself being able to fit a lot of mid-value gold cards into your deck. A lot of 7s, a lot of 8s, a lot of 6s, and even a ton of 9s if you want to go that way. So you can have room for this stuff, and you do kind of need to fill in these gold card slots to have impactful plays. But you have stuff like Triss, you have stuff like Yennefer. Another point that helps out the Hyperthin, and we'll talk about Nilfgaard in a second, is you have also Snowdrop. Snowdrop's a great consistency card. You can use Doral Decree as well with this, and if you Snowdrop into Tactical Decision, that is a huge point tempo play that does not require a high value gold card. You just have your Snowdrop in leader, and you thin your deck. You get a big point play, and it doesn't take any of these 10 or more provision cards. It makes it a very powerful combination. Now that we've talked about this, we'll talk about Nilfgaard for a second here and why it's the best faction for Ciri Nova. And it comes down right here. You have Invocation as a 9 provision card, and you have Vilgefortz as a 9 provision card. These are 2 removal cards that you can't really run otherwise. Like I said, in most neutral control, you cannot play in Ciri Nova decks. I will make a quick shout out here. I didn't mention it in the neutral section. Curse of Corruption you can run as a 9 provision card. That is actually really good a lot of time. You can do that. But in Hyperthin, you don't want to do that because you're going really tall at the end of the game. So we have Invocation and we have Vilgefortz for good control. You also have a deck which sort of doesn't rely on 10 versions or higher cards, and Colgrim. We'll talk about Colgrim for a second here, is that you really, really want Renew and Letho if you're running a Colgrim deck, in my opinion. So that kind of limits it, but you can throw a Colgrim into your deck, which could work with Hyperthin. If you thin your deck a whole bunch, you could have Colgrim as like a round 2 card. This Hyperthin really does not want to get bled, and Colgrim can kind of save you from that. Another note here is Ciri Nova is a fantastic card at overcoming a round 2 push, which Hyperthin struggles with if you play a round 1. So she's handy there. And you also have stuff like Defender. Tibor is a 9 provision card, and Imperial Golem is also there's a 6 provision card, so you can fit both of them very easily in here. That's pretty much your whole strategy. Like I already mentioned, Zarthesius. You can fit almost all of Hyperthin pretty easily without having to run into Ciri Nova complications or limitations you don't want because of her ability. Big ones, like look, all these cards here you don't really need in a Hyperthin deck. You could get away with most of them, although some people do want to run the Vincent or they want to run the Joachim's. You can do that, although Joachim in Hyperthin is a bit iffy. Thinking about Hyperthin here, it's not all Nilfgaard. You can also play Hyperthin Syndicate, which is a deck I have seen a few times. Reason why is you have the Fabian and the Procession of Penance are both 12 for 6s like Imperial Golem. It doesn't have the consistency that Nilfgaard does, but if we talk about what made Nilfgaard good for Hyperthin is it has consistency. It has removal that doesn't require 10 provisions or higher. And you don't have to play Hyperthin, by the way. You don't have to Hyperthin Syndicate for Ciri Nova. But we also talked about how Nilfgaard has those 9 provision removal cards and power cards that are not just like ultra high provision. And if we look here for a second here, we do have those here. You have your Graydon and you have, where is Moralise? And Moralise are both 9 provisions. They both offer very good control, although at a cost for Moralise in particular. And you also have really big plays. You can go with Savala, and you can go with Madame Luzia, although Savala without King of Beggars is significantly weaker. But we'll point that out. You do have these as plays you can do, and you also can go with Bank as another consistency option, so you have that. And if you're going with a Bounty engine, the only thing you're really missing out on here is your Scoundrel, which isn't always played. Junior is a loss that you have to deal with for the deck, and so is Witchfinder. But you don't, and Professor, unfortunately, but you don't need these cards, right? Witchfinder doesn't, you don't need Witchfinder to win with the bounties, although it's good. But you can run Ciri Nova in Syndicate without too much trouble. It's not the most optimal way, but obviously you want to try out Ciri Nova. It is an option. And then we'll try something a little different. I mentioned 2 hyper thin options here. Both of them had decent control options within the 9 provision lower range. And the last one we want to throw out here is going to be monsters. Why monsters? Well, mainly because of 1 card or 2 cards in combination. That's going to be Glusty Warp and Frightener Dormant. Quick shout out here to Naglfar as well as a tutoring option you have in monsters that's 9 provisions or less. Handy to have. But if you go with your Glusty Warp and your Frightener Dormant as finishers with Araka Swarm and leader charges, really, really big play, and it actually gives you a lot of power. And you can sort of go with a swarming deck. The swarming decks, they do gain a lot of power from stuff like Yennefer, but if you want to go with like Araka Swarm type deck, you actually don't need most of these high provision cards. The only thing you're really missing out on Crimson Curse is pretty good for spawning 3 guys. And you do also miss out on Yennefer is really just the big one. But for a Araka Swarm type deck, you can actually go with a lot of your lower provision cards, right? You get power from Bone Talismans, stuff like that you can do. And there's also a higher value play you can do in these lower provisions if you go with stuff like Azrael, Pugo, and Goliath. Something to mention here is you can do that in monsters. But Ciri Nova's limitations are sort of pretty, well, not sort of, they are pretty big. And is she worth the payoff of having all of those provision limits in your deck? That depends on your opinion. Resilience is probably the single most powerful keyword in the game, and there's a reason why Ciri Nova came out with these limitations. As time comes on and the decks get more polarized by high provision cards defining them, she gets a little bit harder to fit into stuff, which is unfortunate. And really the best way to hope for her to get buffed in the future isn't to have her buffed, it's just that the developers need to release cards that are 9 provisions and less that help define decks instead of just these 13 provision cards, these 12 provision cards that you really need in these factions that polarize the decks very high in provisions. If they release more 8 or 9 provision cards, sort of like they did with Rafar's Vengeance before it got nerfed to 10, you can actually have cards that are very impactful for a deck and maybe make a deck that can use Ciri Nova. But for now, I think she's pretty much just limited to those 3 decks we talked about. You can try and find other room for other things, but her limitations keep growing, especially with Devotion now is something in the game. With Devotion, Ciri Nova limits all those cards out of her decks as well because she's neutral, and that's a little annoying, but still love Ciri Nova, and I think we'll make another video or 2 with her coming up because she is so interesting for how you build your decks. But that'll be it for this one, guys. Let me know if there's any other cards you want to talk about or see discussed, and we'll see you next time.